Welcome to the Cathedral's podcast, Crossroads. We explore the intersection of faith and the world in thought-provoking bi-monthly episodes featuring guests from around the world who are seeking to live faithfully in the public square. This is a safe space for tough questions around faith, politics, science, technology, and our responsibilities as citizens. Please join us as we search for a better way forward.
Today's episode, I'm joined by the Reverend Leonard Hamlin, Canon Missioner for the Cathedral, and Kevin Eckstrom, our Chief Public Affairs Officer, to use our holy imaginations as we wonder what the icons found in the cathedral would say to us today. Well, it is so good to sit down with you, Kevin. Thank you for being here today.
I always love being here.
Excellent. And Leonard, always a pleasure to have you back with us.
I am very grateful to be back, as well as to join Kevin in this conversation.
Wonderful. I am thrilled for this conversation because every time you walk into the cathedral, there's something new to inspire us. And we've actually had this conversation on some previous podcasts that the more you get to know the works of art, the more they speak to you. And so we get to talk about how they speak to us today. And to start us off, I want our first question to be, do you have a favorite icon?
It's like, do I have a favorite kid? I love them all equally. No, I think in thinking about this, there's a lot of sort of favorites, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I think it also depends on who is speaking to you in that particular day or that particular moment. And it will change, I think. But I think for me, the one that resonates right now in this moment is Dietrich Bonhoeffer. And Bonhoeffer is tucked away in a side aisle. Honestly, most people don't even know that he's there. And it's part of a series of carvings of 20th century saints. And they're kind of diverse. It's Helen Keller and Pope John the 23rd, of course, was Catholic. Albert Schweitzer, a medical missionary, but also Dietrich Bonhoeffer. And for the folks who aren't as familiar with him, he was a member of what's called the Confessing Church movement in Germany in the 1930s, stood up against Hitler, stood up for what was right, and basically died for it. He was essentially a martyr. But I think what it is about him in this moment is there's a lot of people who see a lot of awful things going on in the world right now and in this country. And Bonhoeffer is a courageous figure. He did what he did, even though he knew that it would likely cost him his life. And he stood up and he did the right thing at the right moment. He held the church accountable at a very pivotal time in history. And I think it's the kind of courageous accountability that we need to see more of at the moment.
And he lived out his ideals because he had come to the United States to study here and spent a little time here and recognized, no, I need to go back, and ended up going back, as you said, to his death.
Yeah, and it would be very easy. I mean, and a lot of people of his time did this exact thing where they said, this is not me, this is not my fight. I'm just going to keep my head down and stay out of trouble. And he didn't. And I think there's a lot to be said there.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Kevin. All right, Leonard, how about you?
No, you can see why I'm excited and really grateful to join the conversation with Kevin. Mm-hmm. There's always the research and his ability to tell stories. When we ask about our favorite, I'm always being asked sometimes about favorite scriptures, and what text I will pick is always my favorite. And just as Kevin was referencing, it changes over time, and some are speaking more loudly in different seasons. Right now, if I were to wrestle with that, maybe for me, it's Howard Thurman. The mystic theologian, as many have often titled him, but his desire for not only unity, but for bringing different faiths and everyone together in a space. Starting, of course, his fellowship church in California. And one of the first of its kind with real intentionality of trying to make sure that we bridge our gaps and, of course, cover our differences. He was a wonderful voice. And when I'm in the cathedral, his placement, perhaps closest to the high altar as well. Don't know if that was ever planned in any way, but it certainly speaks to me and was one of the first probably icons that I noticed when I walked up to the high altar.
And for those of you who are listening, you can go to the cathedral's homepage and scroll down toward the bottom, and there's a gallery there of our 20th century saints. And so many of the people we're talking about today are part of that gallery, so you can see these carvings and learn a little bit more about these individuals, because we can't cover them all today. There are so many. So the North Arcade, this is where many of our 20th century saints are. And for those of you who might come to visit the cathedral, if you are facing the high altar from the west end, the back of the church, it's to the left. And it's this series of carvings that are put up just a little higher. And when I walk through that area, I think of the benediction of all of these people, and perhaps even better, the charge. What is the charge that they are giving us? To go and do likewise, and to walk through this tunnel of history of examples of people who have stood up and who have done really amazing things, living out their lives in holy ways. So I just offer that for people who might come and visit, to walk through that North Arcade.
And that's one of the things I think that makes this cathedral a little unique is, of course, we have John the Baptist and King David and Jesus and Paul and Peter and all the saints, all the folks that you would expect. But this is very much a 20th century cathedral. And, part of the idea was that it's not just these people who lived 2,000 years ago, but it's people who lived 20 years ago, 30 years ago, people who you might not have met, but you could relate to. I remember seeing Mother Teresa on TV, for example. So I knew who she was and what she looked like. And then to see her represented in the cathedral is a different kind of experience. So I think, that's one of the great gifts of the cathedral, is that it ties not only the ancient faith, but contemporary history in a way that's a little, I think, more accessible for a lot of people.
We have a human rights porch with wonderful leaders. And when I was first coming to the cathedral and having a tour, and someone pointed out all of the different leaders who are there, one person who was on the human rights porch I had never heard of.
Let me guess, Jonathan Daniels.
Yes. Will you tell his story?
So Jonathan Daniels was an Episcopal seminarian in the 1960s and went down to Alabama, like a lot of clergy did, and to register Black voters. And as the story goes, he was arrested along with a group of Black teenagers. And it was August in Alabama, so it was hot. And they stopped at a corner store or a country store of some sort. The owner came out with a shotgun, basically told them to leave. They were just causing trouble. And Jonathan stood at the front of the group with the teenagers behind him. And the shop owner fired his shotgun and right into Jonathan, and he died. The most powerful part of that story was that the girl who was standing behind him at the time was here for the dedication of his carving in, I believe, 2015. So that's a living link to the past. So he has become a saint in the Episcopal Church. He has his own feast day. And what's been interesting, when I started here 10 years ago, that was one of the first projects that I worked on, was the dedication of that carving. And over time, the number of people who have come in who have said, "Oh yeah, I knew Jonathan Daniels. I went to seminary with him. He was from my home parish," or something like that. And so it's a very tangible connection to the past for a lot of people who knew who he was.
Being in that space as well, when I arrived, I was not familiar with his story, and wondering, of course, immediately who he was, and hearing all that he was working on. What also fascinated me and continues to fascinate me about the space is that he's directly across, of course, from Rosa Parks, who is there. And it just adds to, of course, the breadth of the story, the struggle, and sometimes both the names that we know and the names that we don't, and how it takes all of us doing what we're able to do to make our lives better. Standing in that space with, whether it's individuals or tours, and seeing everyone look around and reflect, there are the ties that you're able to do. And it touches both the past, but as Kevin was saying, how it really does touch the moments that we're living in right now.
Thinking about Rosa Parks, she was the individual who became the flashpoint for the Montgomery bus boycott. But it was a planned boycott.
Yes.
And she didn't do it alone. So often we think that we have to be that person who is out in front and doing the big things, but the boycott wouldn't have worked if it was just her. She needed all of those people. So thinking about ourselves in these moments, we don't have to always be the person standing up and making that big, big difference. But how are the ways that we can make the small differences?
You raise a great point there. I think I like to refer to many individuals sometimes as they're the ones who open the door. Do we have the will and the courage to go through the door once it's open?
Yes.
There are also those who are not called to just walk through the door, but to hold that door open. Rosa Parks, along with others, they pushed that door open at that time. And there were many others who had to continue to walk through and hold it. Right now, we find ourselves still in a moment, and we're being asked that same question. Are we willing to really give a great witness of the courage and the will, not just on behalf of ourselves, but our neighbors?
So considering all of our 20th century saints, all of these icons, what do you all think, if they had a collective voice, what do you think they would say to us today? Or if you want to pick one person in particular, what do you think they might say to us today?
I think they would tell us to be brave and to have courage, which is not always easy to summon. And I think of right next to Jonathan Daniels is Elie Wiesel. And I got to know, this is another project that I worked fairly intensely on and kind of informally became the unofficial liaison to the Wiesel family as part of that dedication. And it was really fascinating. And I got to know his son and him through history. But one of the things that Elie Wiesel said that I can't get out of my head is that one of the worst things that we can fall prey to is indifference. And that it never benefits the oppressed. It only benefits the oppressor. And it's so easy and so tempting to think of all that's happening in the world as somebody else's problem, either to fix or to deal with, right? I'm powerless. I can't do anything. My voice doesn't matter. But what Elie Wiesel is telling us is, well, you got to start by caring, right? You have to care. And you can't be indifferent to suffering of others. And that's the part of Elie Wiesel that I have not been able to shake ever since we unveiled that statue.
I'm so thankful you told that story. You asked a question about what would they say? And would there be a collective witness? You know, if I could get all of them in the same room, what a conversation it would be. But we would all have to recognize that we're all imperfect. And so there would be a challenge, I think, to us to keep on striving, to recognize our need for each other. And I think that they would collectively be asking each other questions and growing in their own desire to grow. And so I wonder, you know, do I always have and will I always maintain and strive to hold on to that desire, aspirational as it may be, to improve, to get better, not just for myself, but for those who are in the room with me?
It makes me think we often portray progress and leaders such as our 20th century saints as having very confident steps that make a very sure path and we can just follow in those footsteps. But I would imagine that not all steps are confident. They're not all evenly spaced. They're not all purposefully striding, but even an inch of progress is progress. And sometimes you stutter forward and sometimes you do take a big stride, but both are worthwhile.
Without a doubt. You know, what I love about looking at figures in our sacred texts, many of them, of course, captured within the cathedral, as well as the modern day figures that are there, is that we're able to glimpse not just their victories, but their struggles. We like to spend all of our time, of course, in the chapters, the pages, where we see them, of course, in their achievements. But it's the road to get there where we really learn our lessons, where we can find and, of course, recognize their humanity. There is something about being human that I think we have to appreciate a lot more. It is that within the text that says, we're created just a little lower than the angels and crowned with glory and honor. We have yet to appreciate what that really means and to live into it in its fullness.
One of the other figures in the cathedral that sticks with me is Helen Keller. And most people know that, she is buried at the cathedral and in the crypt, and there's a bronze plaque there with Braille on it. And we've actually had to replace it 5 times because the Braille keeps getting rubbed off, which is the point, right? But there's also a carving of her upstairs that most people never see in that gallery of 20th century saints. And she and Jane Addams are paired together. And I can only ever tell the difference because the pearls that they have, one has 2 strands and one has 3 strands, but they look almost identical. But Helen Keller, this is a woman who started out basically blind, deaf, and mute and overcame all of that and, completely changed and inspired the disability community. And everybody knows her story, even if they don't know much about her. But everyone's heard of Helen Keller. But it's a reminder to me that it doesn't matter what your own limitation or disability or shortcomings are. Like, you can still do something. And she certainly did. And if she can do it, then why can't the rest of us?
And sometimes it's our limitations that force us into new creativity, into paths that we wouldn't have anticipated before if we had been able to take a straightforward path. She would not have inspired millions otherwise.
That's the wonderful part as you're raising up many of the other icons and the voices that are there is that, as we look at them individually and collectively, are we really talking about the circumstances that they were in? That's really why they're there, is how they worked through those circumstances. Seeing them puts us and transports us really to a particular time and space. But many of those circumstances are still present with us. And it's on us to really pick up the mantles, as one might say, pick up the mantle and continue the work that was unfinished. Did not end with them, but they're still speaking, and they're speaking to us in this moment. We look at the canopy pulpit always, but there is that icon of King who spoke so eloquently and powerfully before going to Selma and his march here at the cathedral that many of us are still talking about, examining. But we have to look at all of these icons and not pull them out of their circumstances, but appreciate them for what they were doing in their circumstances, and then perhaps wrestle with whether or not we're going to join in the work that they were doing.
That is a great segue to my next question, which is, and this is for everyone to participate in, so all of our listeners at home, as well as you all here, what question would you ask these icons?
I probably, perhaps in this moment, would want to know how they maintained their strength. We see them as, of course, witnesses of strength, wisdom. We could probably characterize so many things there, but they didn't just stop their work. They worked their full life. I remember, and it really still is in the back of my head, remembering a older preacher when I was very young saying to me, one thing he never wanted to do as he got older was drown in shallow water, to do all the work and then almost make it ashore. And I see these figures as making it all the way. Their work was so much of who they are, but they had their own way, and we all have our own individual ways of seeking our strength, seeking our connections. I would love to be able to know from them and to hear how they maintain that.
That is an excellent question. Thank you, Leonard.
I don't want to follow the Baptist preacher after that. So I was thinking of Abraham Lincoln, actually, who is, several places in the cathedral, but, best known for that big tall statue at the back of the nave. And I think I would want to ask him how, very similar to what Leonard was saying, how did you keep going? And how did you not give up? Because it would have been a whole lot easier to say, oh, well, this isn't my fight, or yeah, I'm not going to win this, so I'm not even going to try. And yet he managed to not only unite the country, or half of it anyway, but he saved it. He saved us from ourselves in some ways. So, towering figure of American history. But beyond that, like, he was a very frail human being, right? And struggled with depression and all sorts of things. But yet he found the willpower somehow to keep on going. And I would want to ask him, where did that come from? How'd you do it? Because I think that's one of the big challenges facing all of us right now in this moment is where do we even get started? Or once you get started, how do you keep going? I don't know. But I have a feeling he might have something to say about that.
So there is a long tradition of people from different eras of time having imagined conversations together. In art history, we see that throughout many different periods, different characters from time coming together, representing their own time, but then having a conversation in that particular time. I wonder what it would look like if we brought some of our ancient saints together with our modern saints in this particular time. And I wonder about their conversation.
I'd love to be a fly on the wall. Just even imagining that, if you could just sit in a corner and listen as they would be having conversations with one another, the questions that would be going back and forth, because they were all seeking something. They were all searching for something. And that's an exercise in and of itself. It's an effort. So to watch them go through the exercise and how long it probably would last. I see myself in a room, and I've often pictured that, one day, this is the Baptist preacher, Kevin, one day I do hope to go to heaven. But I say, when I get there, man, I got a lot of questions. I want to sit down, and there's already in my head, there are those I would want to have. How'd you do it? What is going, what happened? What was going through your mind at that moment? So, wrestling to think about them being in that conversation. And I think many, hopefully they'll visit the cathedral and they'll stand in the porch and in front of those icons, and they'll hear the voices themselves speaking across to one another.
See, here's Leonard imagining them talking in heaven, and I'm just imagining how they're going to split the bar tab. Like 8 different credit cards.
That's right.
Does George Washington pick it up for everybody else? But
Did they Venmo?
Yeah,
that's true.
But wouldn't they be fascinated, some of these folks, by the lives that we have? Mm-hmm. And sort of the technology. Like, I think about that sometimes. Like, if George Washington were to come back now and fly on an airplane, like, what would that be like? And so I think it would be just as interesting for some of them to see our lives as it is for us to see theirs.
I'm not going to end us with our typical hope question, because I feel like we've been asking that question this whole time. So thank you so much, Leonard and Kevin, for joining us today and sharing your thoughts and imaginings about our cathedral icons.
It's always fun to be here.
It is actually a pleasure. Thank you.
And thank you for all of the words of hope that we have imagined in thinking of our icons as we've imagined what they might say to us today.
In our next episode, we have the pleasure of sitting down with David Timmis, an expert in disruptive technologies and workforce development. David was formerly with Google and currently is in the leadership of one of the largest employment nonprofits in the world, named Generation, and headquartered in Brussels, Belgium. David will share with us his insight and perspective on what to expect as artificial intelligence reshapes the workforce. From skilling and reskilling to corporate responsibility, we are continuing our exploration of AI and ethics from the practical and timely perspective of the future of work. Thank you for listening to Crossroads, and until next time, many blessings. If the digital offerings of the Cathedral enrich your daily life, please consider becoming a supporter today by making a gift at cathedral.org/inspire.